Welcome to the History AI podcast, where the past comes alive with facts, anecdotes, and a dash of humor. Here are your hosts, Chuck and Marco.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the History AI podcast. I'm Chuck.
And I'm Marco. And today, we're diving into one of the most chilling and controversial tragedies of the 20th century, the Holodomor, or the terror famine that struck Ukraine in the early 1930s.
Before we begin, a quick reminder, if you appreciate the stories we bring to light, hit that subscribe button, leave us a 5-star review, and don't forget to share the podcast with fellow history lovers.
And be sure to check out our link tree in the show notes for merch, past episodes, and our socials. Oh, and stick around after the episode for the song Fields of Silence, the Ballad of the Holodomor.
To understand the Holodomor, we need to go back to the early 20th century, because this tragedy didn't happen in a vacuum. It was rooted in politics, revolution, and centuries of conflict over land and identity.
At the end of World War I and during the Russian Civil War, Ukraine declared independence several times, but was eventually absorbed into the Soviet Union in 1922. That union wasn't a happy marriage. Ukraine was rich in resources, especially grain, and Moscow wanted control.
Ukraine was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. Its deep black soil, Chernozem, was some of the most fertile on earth. For centuries, Ukrainian farmers had fed empires. But under Soviet rule, that abundance became a liability.
Why? Because Stalin had a vision. In the late 1920s, he launched his first 5-year plan, an aggressive push to industrialize the USSR at breakneck speed. But factories don't run on empty stomachs. To fuel the cities and buy foreign machinery, he needed grain exports. Lots of them.
That's where collectivization came in. Stalin ordered the seizure of private farmland to create massive, state-run collective farms, called kolkhozy. In theory, these farms would be more efficient. In practice, chaos.
Ukrainian peasants, known as kulaks if they owned even modest land, resisted fiercely. And to Stalin, resistance meant rebellion. He branded the kulaks as enemies of the people and launched a brutal dekulakization campaign. Homes were raided. Property confiscated. Families deported to Siberia or shot.
In 1930 alone, nearly 1.8 million Ukrainians were deported as part of this campaign. The countryside was traumatized. And yet, the resistance didn't disappear. If anything, it hardened.
And that's where Ukraine's national identity became a problem for Stalin. Ukraine had a long tradition of independence movements, a rich language and culture, and its own intelligentsia. Stalin saw nationalism as a threat, especially in a place that had already tried to break away from Moscow.
So what do you do if you're a totalitarian regime trying to crush both independence and hunger for freedom?
You break the back of the people. You use starvation not just as a consequence of policy, but as a weapon.
What followed would go beyond failed economics. It was deliberate. It was calculated. And it would kill millions.
As collectivization swept across Ukraine, resistance only grew. Many peasants refused to give up their land or livestock. Others sabotaged efforts, hiding grain, slaughtering animals, or refusing to work the collective fields.
To Stalin, this wasn't just economic defiance, it was political rebellion. He believed that Ukrainian farmers were deliberately trying to undermine the Soviet state. His response was ruthless.
In 1932, the Soviet regime imposed impossibly high grain quotas on Ukraine, quotas that couldn't be met even in a good harvest year. But 1932 was not a good year. Poor weather and disruption from forced collectivization had already reduced output. Even so, Moscow demanded more.
When the quotas weren't met, Soviet officials sent in requisition brigades, armed groups tasked with finding every last kernel of grain. They didn't just take wheat. They took potatoes, beets, corn, peas, anything edible. Even seed grain for the next year's crops was seized.
They searched homes, tore up floorboards, dug into gardens, even raided stashes hidden in stables or cemeteries. In many villages, entire food supplies were wiped out overnight. Families were left with absolutely nothing.
And to enforce this campaign, Stalin unleashed another weapon, legal terror. In August 1932, the Soviet government passed the infamous Law of 5 Heirs of Grain. Under this decree, Anyone, even a child, caught taking leftover grain from a field could be sentenced to 10 years in prison or execution.
The law was brutally enforced. Over 125,000 people were convicted under it in 1933 alone. Some were sentenced for stealing a handful of wheat or a few stalks of corn to feed starving children.
As starvation took hold, many Ukrainians tried to escape, flee to other regions of the Soviet Union where food might be more available. Stalin anticipated this. In January 1933, a state decree sealed the borders of Ukraine and parts of southern Russia.
Trains were stopped. Roads were patrolled. Refugees were turned back, left to die in their villages. And in cities like Kharkiv and Kiev, food rationing was suddenly revoked for Ukrainians who didn't meet labor quotas or were deemed unreliable.
And it wasn't just physical hunger. It was cultural erasure, too. Ukrainian schools were shuttered. The Ukrainian language was repressed. Churches were closed. Priests, poets, and professors were arrested or disappeared. Even books written in Ukrainian were pulled from shelves.
This wasn't about punishing individual rebels. It was about crushing the Ukrainian spirit, breaking a nation that had dared to hold on to its identity.
By mid-1933, villages became silent. No livestock sounds. No children laughing. Just hunger, sickness, and death. And still, the grain trains rolled out of Ukraine, bound for export to Europe, used to fund Stalin's industrial dream.
The Soviet government claimed there was no famine. But the world knew. Diplomats, foreign correspondents, and even Soviet insiders raised the alarm. And still, the denials continued.
This was not a natural disaster. It was not an accident. It was a policy of pain, designed to bring Ukraine to its knees. By the end of 1932, Ukraine was in freefall. Stalin's grain seizures, border lockdowns, and cultural crackdowns had set the stage. Now came the death spiral. The winter of 1932-33 would go down as one of the darkest periods in Ukrainian history.
Villages that once bustled with the rhythms of planting and harvest fell into silence. Entire communities collapsed. No grain, no bread, and no mercy. People began to starve, slowly, agonizingly. First the old and then the children.
They say the famine came in stages. At first, hunger. Then exhaustion. Then madness. Survivors remembered how neighbors grew so weak they couldn't stand. Mothers could no longer produce milk. Children cried until they couldn't anymore.
People scavenged anything. Tree bark, grass, leaves, even clay and dirt, rolled into small cakes just to feel something in their stomachs. Pets disappeared. Then stray animals. Then something worse.
There are documented reports of cannibalism, some from Soviet police themselves. In desperation, families turned on one another. Parents doing the unthinkable. Not because they were monsters, but because the system left them no other choice.
Fathers left home to search for food and never returned. Trains rolled through, packed with grain exports, while peasants died just yards away on the station platforms. Soviet soldiers stood guard, ensuring no one touched the food meant for Stalin's empire.
And all this was happening in what had once been the richest farmland in Europe. People were starving on the soil that had fed a continent.
By spring of 1933, death was everywhere. Entire families gone. Empty homes with doors ajar. Streets lined with the bodies of the unburied. Fields untended, tools rusting in place. In some towns, more than half the population died in a matter of months.
The numbers are staggering. At the peak of the famine, 25,000 people were dying every single day. Over 4 million Ukrainians perished, though some estimates go far higher. Not just statistics, these were children, grandparents, teachers, farmers.
And yet, outside the USSR, much of the world remained silent, or worse, misled. Gareth Jones, a British journalist, traveled through starving Ukrainian villages and bravely reported what he saw. But other reporters, like Walter Durante of the New York Times, dismissed it all as exaggeration.
Durante even wrote, "There is no actual starvation, but there is widespread mortality from diseases due to malnutrition." He downplayed the genocide, and won a Pulitzer for it. That award still hasn't been revoked.
Inside Ukraine, the silence was enforced with terror. Those who dared speak of the famine were arrested or simply disappeared. Talking about hunger became a crime.
This was famine with a purpose. Starvation used as a scalpel to cut away resistance, culture, and hope. What Stalin couldn't conquer with ideology, he tried to erase with hunger.
It wasn't just a humanitarian disaster. It was an act of calculated brutality. Ukraine wasn't just being punished. It was being broken. By late 1933, the worst of the famine began to subside, but not because of any great act of mercy from the Soviet regime. There were simply fewer mouths to feed. Entire villages had vanished. Whole regions were depopulated.
The Ukrainian countryside looked like a graveyard. Crops once again grew in the fields, but there were no farmers left to harvest them. Schools stood empty. Churches locked. The silence wasn't just physical, it was cultural.
Stalin didn't stop at starvation. He followed the famine with a wave of intellectual and cultural repression. Ukrainian poets, artists, priests, and professors, those who survived the famine, were rounded up, arrested, and executed or sent to the Gulag.
It was a 1-2 punch. First, break the body. Then, break the soul.
And then came the cover-up. The Soviet government denied the famine ever happened. It erased records. It punished those who talked about it. Even mentioning the word Holodomor could get you branded as a traitor.
Meanwhile, the outside world looked away. Foreign governments, especially in the West, were reluctant to challenge the Soviet narrative. Some were focused on appeasement. Others were just unwilling to believe that a state could starve millions of its own people on purpose.
Soviet propaganda filled the vacuum. Photos of happy Ukrainian farmers in bright red banners, bountiful harvests, thriving collectives, all staged lies. And for decades, those lies held.
It wasn't until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 that Ukraine was finally free to tell its story. Survivors came forward. Mass graves were uncovered. Diaries and secret documents began to surface.
In 2006, Ukraine officially recognized the Holodomor as a genocide. Over 30 countries now agree. Others, especially those with lingering ties to Soviet narratives, still dispute it. Russia, for example, continues to deny the famine was anything more than a tragic mismanagement of policy.
But the evidence is overwhelming: the requisition quotas, the sealed borders, the refusal of foreign aid, the targeting of Ukrainian identity. This wasn't just a famine. It was intentional annihilation, not with bullets or bombs, but with hunger.
And the scars run deep. Today, nearly every Ukrainian family has a story passed down of hunger, of loss, of silence. Entire generations were wiped out. Language was lost. Memory was buried under fear.
But memory has power. And in Ukraine today, remembering the Holodomor isn't just history, it's a form of defiance. A declaration that they survived. And they remember. The Holodomor didn't end in 1933, not really. Its aftershocks have rippled across generations. You can still feel it in the bones of Ukraine, in its language, its culture, and its defiant spirit.
The loss of millions of lives left deep demographic scars. In some regions, it took decades for the population to recover. In others, the loss was permanent. Villages disappeared from maps. Family lines ended. Traditions vanished without a trace.
And beyond the numbers, there was trauma. Survivors rarely spoke of it. Some were too young to remember, others too afraid. Many kept their memories locked away, afraid the knock on the door might come again.
For decades, Soviet textbooks made no mention of the famine. It wasn't taught in schools. It wasn't shown in films. It wasn't even whispered in private. The Holodomor became a national memory built on silence.
But silence doesn't last forever. After Ukraine declared independence in 1991, a flood of buried truths came pouring out. Eyewitness testimonies. Secret Soviet memos. Hidden diaries. What emerged wasn't just a clearer picture, it was a reckoning.
Memorials were erected. A national day of remembrance was established. And the word Holodomor, once banned, became sacred. It means death by hunger, but it also means resistance through memory.
In modern Ukraine, the Holodomor is more than a historical event, it's a rallying cry. A reminder that the struggle for identity, independence, and survival didn't start in 1991. It has deep roots, soaked in blood and defiance, and that's why remembering the Holodomor matters, not just for Ukraine, but for the world. It's a lesson in what happens when truth is silenced. When a regime chooses control over compassion. When the world looks the other way.
There's a quote often attributed to Raphael Lemkin, the man who coined the term the genocide. He said the Holodomor was the classic case. A genocide not just of people, but of a nation's soul.
But Ukraine's soul didn't die. It endured. In song. In story. In remembrance. And now, through this podcast, maybe, in your heart too.
Thanks for joining us today. If this episode moved you, we ask just one thing: don't stay silent. Share it. Talk about it. Let the world know. For more content, merch, and every past episode, check out our link tree in the show notes.
Until next time, stay curious, stay courageous. And stay tuned right after this for our original song, Fields of Silence, the Ballad of the Holodomor.
Whispers ride the winter wind through villages that once would sing, but now the barns are hollowed bones, and death walks where the wheat once grew. The children's laughter's turned to cries, the mother's hands too weak to rise, the soil betrayed by silent blades, and hope was starved beneath the skies. Fields of silence, fields of pain, where golden harvest died in vain. No songs remain, no bread to store, only ghosts of the Holodomor. Through famine's grip and tyrants lie, a million souls were left to die. We'll speak their names forevermore, the ones who starved in 34. The grain was locked, the gates were closed, the black earth wept, the truth imposed by hands of steel and hearts of stone. The cruelest seeds were coldly sown. They took the bread, they took the breath, they wrote the law that dealt out death, but silence cannot still the grave. The winds remember every name. Fields of silence, fields of pain, where golden harvest died in vain. No songs remain, no bread to store, only ghosts of the Holodomor. Through famine's grip and tyrants lie, a million souls were left to die. We'll speak their names forevermore, the ones who starved in 34. You can bury truth in shadow, but it rises with the dawn. Every scar upon this meadow marks the lost ones who live on. Fields of silence, fields of pain still whisper through the falling rain. No empires lie, no fear, no war can hush the cry, Holodomor. So light a flame and sing once more for all who died in 34.